What I'm saying is we have the order wrong, right? It starts with people who know how to write something, how to write a document to get a spy warrant. It's not like it comes out of the blue from Christopher Steele, who's finding all this marvelous stuff and has to go to the FBI. It's the other way around. That's what's going on. And Steele's job, I call him in a chapter, the Avatar, chapter 6, the Avatar. That's Steele's job. He's a salesman. He's marketing this document to the press, and he's going to the FBI. He's standing in front of the FBI to legitimize this document, which the FBI probably may have had a role in composing.
Just why does investigative journalist Lee Smith believe the so-called Steele dossier was not actually written by Christopher Steele? Who does he think did the authoring? How has the mainstream media been complicit in the Spygate scandal? What are the broader implications for America? And why does Smith believe that all of this, including the current impeachment inquiry against President Trump, is part of a broad coup attempt against the president? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jekielek. Today we sit down with Hudson Institute's senior fellow Lee Smith, author of The Plot Against the President, the true story of how Congressman Devin Nunes uncovered the biggest political scandal in U.S. history. Lee Smith, really excellent to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So Lee, you've written a really remarkable book, The Plot Against the President. It's focused on the investigations that were spearheaded by Congressman Devin Nunes. You know, there's been a lot of books recently written about what people call Spygate, some people call Obamagate, and so forth. And I'm wondering if you could just give us an idea of what your book brings to this discussion.
Right. One of the most important, there's a lot of fantastic books written by our colleagues. Dan Bongino, Greg Jarrett, Kimberly Strassel has written a terrific book that touches on a lot of the same issues. One of the things that I wanted to make sure I did, after 3 years of this, maybe more, after basically 3.5 years of this operation played not only against the president but against the American public, we have a pretty good idea of who the bad guys are and what the bad guys did. The people in the intelligence community, the figures in the press who have done these different things. One of the things we didn't know much about is who the good guys are. And I thought it was very important to tell a story about Congressman Devin Nunes and about the people on his team, public servants who stood up at a very difficult time, and they really walked through the fire to bring this different information to the American public. And so I wanted to tell their story. I wanted to tell a story about something to help inspire, help clarify to the public that there are people who are doing the right thing, and hopefully to even inspire some people as well.
So one of these key figures working with Congressman Nunes was Kasia Patel. He figures prominently. Maybe can you tell us a little bit about him and what he did?
Mr. Patel is a fantastic figure. You know, I started off writing the book where I was speaking to the congressman, and we spoke so much. I spoke with his communications director as well, Jack Langer, a terrific guy, another one of the heroes in the story, and another one of the heroes in my book. And as it turned out, their lead investigator, Kasia Patel, was willing to talk to me as well. Mr. Patel is a former DOJ prosecutor, so he knew a lot of these figures. He'd worked with them at the Department of Justice. Strzok and Page, McCabe, Comey, as he describes in the book, he'd been in the same room with them. But Mr. Patel is a fascinating figure. He grew up here in New York to Indian parents. Grew up in Long Island. Was born in Queens. So he's this ideal sort of American figure of immigrant parents, and he's a fantastic New York figure as well. A guy who's from Queens, like the 45th president of the United States, and as Congressman Nunes says, that they wouldn't have been able to do all the things they were able to do without Kasia Patel. So he's someone that you may have noticed has been They've been dragging him through the press of late, and one of the reasons they're dragging him through the press in places like the New York Times and Politico is because they're worried about him. We talk about, as we know, there's this issue with a so-called whistleblower who's at the foundations of the impeachment theater conducted against Donald Trump. Real whistleblowers, people who are really calling out abuses and crimes, like Kasia Patel. These are the people whose names are actually dragged through the mud. This whistleblower is turned into a hero of the resistance. But people who are really looking at crimes, people who are really looking at abuses, those are the people who are banged up in the press. And these are the people who really deserve our praise and our thanks.
I'm going to jump into some of the things that Cash is referenced in your book as doing a little later. But basically, you make a lot of really interesting assertions. You raise a lot of new information, or at least things that I wasn't aware of anyhow. But first of all, when do you think that this investigation into the Trump campaign began, based on everything that you know?
The assessment I'm working on is something that the Congressman has said, which I have in the book as well, late 2015, early 2016, and it looks like it starts. One of the bits of evidence that we have to point to late 2015, early 2016 is the operation against General Michael Flynn. But we can go back even a little bit further, because we see that Nellie Ohr was hired in October 2015 to start doing opposition research into the Trump campaign. But of course, there is no Trump campaign really at that point. There's candidate Trump, and there's some peripheral figures around him. But she was really hired in October 2015 to look into Donald Trump's alleged connections to Russian organized crime figures. So we can say it might begin right around there, sometime between October and December, sometime between October 2015 and January 2016. The dates are much earlier than most people, certainly much earlier than July 31st, 2016, which is what the FBI says kicked off their investigation of the Trump team.
And so one of the narratives that's out there is that it was actually, you know, Republicans that funded that research. Is that correct?
Right. It's sort of complicated. I mean, what Fusion GPS was doing at a certain point, they were doing opposition research. And opposition research, it's a relatively honest industry. You know, it's something that people need in politics. You find out what your opponent is up to. People pay to find this. People pay to find it out, and then they use it in different ways against their opponent. This appears to be what the Washington Free Beacon was engaged in, looking for opposition research on Donald Trump. At a certain point, the Free Beacon cut off its Trump material. They had nothing to do, they say, with the Steele dossier, which I think is correct. And at a certain point, they cut themselves off from Fusion entirely. If you'd like, I'll talk about what I think is a very important transition from the opposition research and from what we talk about the opposition research regarding Trump's ties to organized crime. If we look at the Steele dossier, the first report is June 20th, 2016. The Steele dossier has nothing to do with organized crime. What it's about is, it's about the Trump team's alleged ties to a foreign power, right? So this changes profoundly. We're not talking about crime, we're talking about espionage and clandestine activities. What that says is, to me, that shows that the groundwork for a counterintelligence investigation is being laid in the Steele dossier. The way that I interpret the Steele dossier is as a sort of key or instrument with which to break into the Trump campaign. That's fundamentally what we're looking at here. That's what happened. That the FBI, on behalf of the Hillary Clinton campaign, broke into the Trump campaign. It's important to remember, we've spoken rightly about the different abuses and crimes committed by the FBI's small group, the Crossfire Hurricane team, and the other people who were around this, including former CIA Director John Brennan. But it's important to keep in mind who the primary beneficiary was of collecting information, looking for dirt, finding an October surprise on the Trump campaign. And that's the Clinton campaign. This is about Hillary Clinton. We have to remember that that's what this points to. A lot of the times we've gotten so caught up in so many different things. If you look at the basic outline of this operation, remember, the Clinton campaign paid Fusion GPS, right? They were looking for something to get on Trump. As it turns out, what they got on Trump is something extraordinary. They got a counterintelligence investigation. They were looking to find something in the Trump team's communications that would help smash the Trump campaign.
In the book, you basically say that Christopher Steele most likely wasn't the author of the Steele dossier.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
There are a number of different pieces of evidence I have in the book. One of them is a series of documents, which I call in the book, it's the 4th chapter, I believe, called the proto-dossiers.
Right.
These are a number of documents I acquired from a source, and these are Fusion GPS documents. The most significant one, I'll lay them out. There are
Please. 2
that are about Paul Manafort, devoted entirely to Paul Manafort. There's another one. It's a collection of reports: Donald Trump in Azerbaijan, Donald Trump in Georgia, Donald Trump in Serbia. These are smaller dossiers looking at, again, former Soviet states. The real important one is dated May 20th, May 2016, called Donald Trump in Russia. And what this is this is the actual, the bones, as it were, of the Steele dossier. It has all the names that we see in the Steele dossier. It has Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, Carter Page, and it makes roughly the same allegations, but they're hedged. For instance, it may be, I can't remember the exact phrase in the book now, but may pose a threat to national security. Trump's relations with these people may pose a threat. Well, what we see with the Steele report, the first Steele report, June 20th, 2 things happen. First of all, they take the fundamental claims and they exaggerate them, right? What they have is, it's not just that it may raise certain questions for national security, but that Donald Trump has actually been compromised by the Russians. So that's one of the things that happens within that month, right? The idea that Christopher Steele, I don't care about everything I've heard about his reputation from the press. You're not going to find out in a month's time that not only does Donald Trump have somewhat questionable relations with some figures who may or may not be tied to organized crime, but in fact, no. In fact, we have it from a number of high-level Kremlin sources that Donald Trump has in fact been compromised by Russia. This is preposterous. These ideas defy all logic. The reason that they were pushed down the throat of the American public, the reason that we had the FBI's investigation, the reason we had the Mueller report, is because of the role of the press in pushing this. Not only failing to ask basic questions, but obscuring these questions and pushing fake narratives. So the idea that Christopher Steele, that's one piece of evidence. Another, in a later chapter, in chapter 20, called The Forgers, I go through an interview that Steele conducted with the State Department official Kathleen Kavalek. She's taken notes about her interview when Steele is talking about his findings. Well, it's clear that Steele doesn't even know the details of his own dossier. He starts saying a number of things that are, I mean, one of the famous ones is, for instance, when he tells her about some sort of activities at the Russian consulate in Miami. And she notes in her notes, like, well, there is no Russian consulate in Miami.
Okay.
So that's fairly well known, but the important thing that people have missed, it's not that there's no Russian consulate in Miami. In the Steele dossier, the claim is that it has to do with consular officials in Miami. He says consulate. He didn't know the details of his own report. There are a number of different mistakes like that show, writers, as we both know, you remember at least the basic and fundamental details, especially if this guy was worried, as he writes, whoever the author of the report is, that the Western alliance is under attack. This catastrophic thing is happening. The Russians have undermined not only a presidential election, but now they actually control an American president. Well, you would expect a former British secret agent to at least get the details of his own report right. Christopher Steele does not.
So, the implication here is that, he learned these facts from something that was already written for him. Who wrote it?
I think there are probably a number of different contributors. I think the most important allegations are, well, let me put it like this. The Russians that Steele claims as his source, according to the State Department official Kathleen Kavalek. One of the most important sources, he says, is a former high-level Russian intelligence official, Trubnikov. Mm-hmm. Well, as it turns out, Stefan Halper, who, as we've seen reported, was the FBI's confidential human source sent to spy on the Trump campaign. Well, Stefan Halper claimed that Trubnikov was also his source for a Pentagon document. And actually, Halper teaches at Cambridge. He'd invited Trubnikov to Cambridge at least twice. He claimed him as a source for a document that he was doing for 2015 to 2016. If you look at these documents, though, from Halper's report, you realize he's misleading the Pentagon officials who paid for this document. Halper established a pattern of misleading U.S. government officials about his relationship with this source that Christopher Steele also claimed. What I believe happened, I think the evidence points to the fact that it's Stefan Halper who is injecting that material into the dossier. And again, Halper is a major figure here. We need to keep in mind, he ran the operation against Michael Flynn. Mm-hmm. He ran, or at least played a very important role in the operations against Carter Page and George Papadopoulos as well. Halper, I believe the evidence points to the idea that Halper is a major source for the dossier.
So in that sense, it's not coming from Fusion GPS. Where's it coming from, really?
One of the things that we will need to know, one of the things that I hope U.S. Attorney John Durham is looking at is where are the different places where Fusion GPS's work merges with the FBI's work. Is Stefan Halper, who again is reportedly a confidential human source for the FBI, what kind of relationship does he have with Fusion? What exactly did he do for the FBI? What was his entire role in this operation? If you can, I'd like to speak about Halper for a second
Sure.
more. Stefan Halper, again, he's been described as a confidential human source and as swamp royalty, insofar as his ex-father-in-law, Ray Klein, was a very high-level official at the CIA. Well, the most important thing that we know about Stefan Halper is actually Halper's role as a dirty tricks operative. In 1980, Halper was hired from the Bush campaign to join the Reagan campaign by none other than CNN political analyst David Gergen. Halper's job was to be on the lookout for an October surprise. Remember, the Reagan campaign was doing extremely well. The Carter campaign at the time was in trouble. But the different times that the Carter campaign surged in support was related to different foreign affairs, especially all of the hostages held by the Iranians. What the Reagan campaign appears to have been concerned about was an October surprise that would crush or push Carter past Reagan in the polls. Halper's job, he was running a network of ex-CIA spies to defend against an October surprise. It appears that Halper's role in the 2016 campaign was something very similar, to both defend against potential October surprises as well as to find an October surprise. As we were talking about before, this was really This appears to be the purpose, or one purpose, of obtaining the spy warrant on Carter Page, allowing them to look at the campaign's communications. They were looking for some sort of dirt on Donald Trump, presumably, hopefully for them, I assume, Russia-related, but probably anything would have done the trick.
You know, one of the things that is kind of out in the open, I guess, is that is the FISA abuse.
Right.
I guess you would say that the spying operation was predicated on false information that got these FISA warrants obtained. That at least that's what the allegations are. What new information are you presenting here related to this?
The nature of the dossier, I think, is important to understand what it was, because there's been a debate, or there's been some sort of argument when the FBI gets the Steele dossier, which we now know is compromised, thanks to the work of Congressman Nunes and his team. We know that the Steele dossier was paid for by the Clinton campaign. So the question has been, well, when did the FBI get it? Did they get this in July, or did they get it sometime in September, which is what they say? It didn't actually go to the Crossfire Hurricane team until sometime in September. I think that what we're looking at is I think it's the evidence of the proto-dossier suggests that there are people at the FBI or DOJ, or there's someone who knows how to write a document to satisfy the requirements to obtain a spy warrant on the Trump campaign. What I'm saying is we have the order wrong, right? It starts with people who know how to write something, how to write a document to get a spy warrant. It's not like it comes out of the blue from Christopher Steele, who's finding all this marvelous stuff and has to go to the FBI. It's the other way around. That's what's going on. And Steele's job, I call him in a chapter, the Avatar, chapter 6, the Avatar. That's Steele's job. He's a salesman. He's marketing this document to the press, and he's going to the FBI. He's standing in front of the FBI to legitimize this document, which the FBI probably may have had a role in composing.
That would be huge if that bears out what you're suggesting.
I think that the proto-dossiers point to that. I think if we look at the legend that's been built up around Christopher Steele, we know that Christopher Steele, or we're told that it was Christopher Steele's spectacular, amazing work with the FBI and Department of Justice in the investigation of corruption into the World Soccer's governing board, FIFA. Well, what it turns out, what Christopher Steele actually did was he interviewed a number of DOJ officials. He introduced a number of DOJ officials to a British journalist who had been following FIFA stuff for a long time. That's the public evidence we had of Steele's role. Steele was also said to have, or he's reported to have been hired to look at Russia's role trying to secure the 2018 World Cup bid. This was part of the same FIFA research. Well, those reports never surfaced because they were not credible. They were said to be, they were reportedly not legally credible. They were incendiary, but not legally credible. They eventually surfaced in the press in 2014. And if you look at what Steele is saying, it's astonishing, because the allegations he makes about FIFA are the precise allegations he makes in the Steele dossier. He names the same Russian energy executive, Igor Sechin, who is responsible for, in the FIFA work, he says Sechin is bribing officials from the Gulf Emirate of Qatar to help the Russians get the 2018 World Cup bid. Now, merely 2 years later, he swaps out Qatar and inserts Carter Page. Now he's saying that the same Russian energy executive, Igor Sechin, is offering Carter Page an enormous bribe, also having to do with energy-related issues, in exchange for a possible Trump administration dropping sanctions on Russia related to Ukraine. Steele is repeating the same things. This is not research, right? What Steele has been getting paid to do, what he was paid to do in the dossier, was to legitimize false information.
So that's interesting, because this bit of evidence now suggests that he maybe did play a bigger authorship role.
I would
right?
say that this is the one piece. This is the one piece of information that in the dossier that probably comes from Christopher Steele. This bit about Igor Sechin. That's that's what I say. That's the point I believe I make in the book as well. That this would be the one place where we can see Steele's hand, since he made that claim in 2014 as well.
So, you actually describe another dossier in the book, and in fact, well, it's not officially called a dossier, it's called the Intelligence Community Assessment, the IC assessment. You describe it as the Obama dossier. Right. Why do you say this?
Well, that's Congressman Nunes' phrase for it, which I think is quite apt. Because after the election, after Trump was elected, the Intelligence Community Assessment that Obama ordered played much the same role. It legitimized all of these news reports, and it legitimized a chain of events, as former Director of National Intelligence James Clapper said, that evolved into the Mueller Special Counsel investigation. And if you look at this Intelligence Community Assessment, the different claims it makes, the different logic it's based on, it's preposterous. Congressman Nunes is very generous, saying that some of the claims are legitimate and real. And of course, yes, we can see that Russia Today, for instance, is a propaganda network. But the idea that somehow Russia Today is a masterful, the fact that Russia Today criticized Hillary Clinton, and that's evidence that the Kremlin itself was supporting Donald Trump, is nonsense. And the idea that this found its way into an intelligence community product should make U.S. taxpayers extremely concerned, not just about the actual operation they were waging against the sitting president, but the fact that if this is the kind of stuff that they're pushing through intelligence channels, what are they to be believed about? I don't mean to skip ahead too far, but if you want to, for a moment, if we can't talk about the whistleblower stuff, since this is in the news, it's not clear to me at what point people even on the center right will actually see what's going on here, right? They're right to be very worried about the impeachment stuff, how this is leading toward impeachment. I think the most important thing to be worried about is the fact that we have an active CIA officer who is part of an operation to take down the president. I think that's astonishing. I mean, this is the stuff of bad 70s movies, but this is what's happening right now. So we have some very serious questions to ask of our intelligence community leaders, including the person who's now directing the CIA, Gina Haspel. We hear that she's very good at what she does. She's extremely talented and gifted. Nonetheless, when we see an active officer running a campaign like this, we should certainly be asking what is going on in that institution. Did no one have a conversation with this gentleman when he came over from the White House and said, "You appear to have gotten some bad habits by leaking information to the press. We've heard this going on. We don't do this in this building over here. You are being watched. You should behave yourself." Well, if that conversation never did take place, he didn't heed it. He didn't heed that warning. Instead, again, the whistleblower is in the middle of an operation to undo the 2016 election. It's astonishing. I do not see how, combined with the FBI's investigation, ostensibly, or as they claim, beginning July 2016, and now the whistleblower aspect of the operation, I don't see how the intelligence community comes out of this looking the way it does now. I mean, there will have to be a profound and thoroughgoing reassessment of what purpose the intelligence community is meant to play. Certainly no Americans want to be governed by the intelligence community. John McLaughlin, former deputy director of the CIA, was stoking his ego and the ego of John Brennan and other former intelligence community officials saying, thank God for the deep state. Well, I assure you most Americans do not feel that way. We don't want to be governed by unelected officials, and we don't want to be spied on by unelected officials, and we don't want unelected bureaucrats trying to take out the president that has been elected by the American public. So this is one of the enormous issues that will be coming down the road. We're not even there yet, but once people have had a chance to breathe, once people have had a chance to see the larger picture, which we're still unfolding, we're still piecing together. Once we do, and once the role of the CIA and the FBI, senior officials are made clear, then we're going to have a very, very serious conversation in this country about the role of the intelligence community.
So, Lee, I'm reminded of the case that you describe extensively, or well, somewhat, in the book of General Flynn, of course, one of the kind of early leaks of classified information, that you detail in the book. And something that was very interesting in there is you make the point that, a story which was never kind of outlined, what the media should have jumped on is the fact, wow, there was this high-level leak of classified information, and no one saw that as being the story. Right. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, this happened throughout it continues to happen today. These leaks of classified information, the leaks of different information, they're advancing the anti-Trump operation. So no one is going to say, my goodness, who has leaked? Who has leaked the entire transcript of Donald Trump's phone calls with the President of Mexico and the Prime Minister of Australia? This is terrible. This is a catastrophe. Are you saying that the President cannot conduct foreign policy? He can't speak with foreign leaders? Well, that's the point. The point was, and this is one of the things that we're seeing right now with the whistleblower stuff, it's like, well, the President is not allowed to conduct his own foreign policy. He's not allowed to speak with Ukrainian officials without anyone listening in, without a subordinate at the National Security Council staff having a say. This is exactly what's been going on, and this is the issue, of course, that should have been covered by the press. And this is one of the things that I wrote when I was asking certain reporters comment I asked them if they wanted to have a comment in the book. I said, did it never occur to you to report on the fact that the intelligence community was waging an operation against the president through these leaks, through these selective leaks of classified information? But of course that was ridiculous because they knew exactly what was going on. They were part of the operation. That's what was happening. The press was the platform for the anti-Trump operation. There is no operation without places like the Washington Post, the New York Times, CNN, and NBC, among the most prestigious names in American media, without their coordination, without their full-throated support of this operation against Donald Trump. But I just want to come back to General Flynn for a second, if I may, since you mentioned that.
Sure.
General Flynn, one of the, I mentioned before that I believe that this operation, there's evidence that this operation against Trump begins as an operation against General Flynn, even actually before Flynn has officially joined the Trump campaign. Michael Flynn had been speaking for a long time about reforming the intelligence community. Now, the reason that was so important to go after Flynn after Trump won was because Flynn was talking about auditing the intelligence community. Flynn was talking about asking the senior intelligence service, hundreds of people across the Beltway, for their resignations. As Congressman Nunes explained, that doesn't mean that all of them were going to be fired, but they were going to have to justify what they were doing. And many of them wouldn't have made the cut. Now, if you look at what Stefan Halper was doing, the man who targeted Flynn, this was a perfect illustration. This was a man who was running political operations. He was getting paid by the Pentagon, their private think tank, Office of Net Assessments, and this man wound up running operations against a presidential campaign. General Flynn wanted to find out what the intelligence community was doing, to what extent it was serving the American people, and to what extent it was filling their own wallets and entertaining their own political desires and fantasies, how they wanted to see the bureaucracy shape up on behalf of their interests, not on behalf of the American people. We see, therefore, how important it was for these people to flush out General Flynn, to get Flynn out of the way. Conversely, we also see how important General Flynn's work was, or what he wanted to do. This audit, this demand the senior intelligence service hand in their resignations. And I believe that General Flynn, he's certainly been vindicated. I hope he's entirely cleared, of course. The other thing is, though, the work that General Flynn planned, this is what we need to take up. We need to find out where these people are burying money, what kind of black programs they're using against the American public, against the against the leaders that Americans have elected. So, yeah, Flynn's work is more important. We see now, after 3 years, that what General Flynn wanted to do is more important now than ever.
Sidney Powell, General Flynn's current lawyer, who's actually been on the show before, prior to her being the lawyer, she is basically saying that there's exculpatory evidence that was withheld early on in the Flynn case that would basically exonerate him, as I understand it anyway. She's making that case. Do you know anything about this?
I don't. What I will say, though, is that with a number of Ms. Powell's findings, what we're finding out is that she is helping in many ways, parallel to what Congressman Nunes has done, and of which my book is an accounting, but she is putting forth information, so we're getting a fuller picture of what these political operatives, deep state operatives, did to General Flynn, what they did to President Trump. The information that she is putting forth is helping enrich our understanding of what happened, which is fantastic. And I also hope, again, it entirely clears General Flynn, as well as illuminating for the rest of the country what our intelligence community and what political operatives did to General Flynn.
In the book, I wanted to, there's a few kind of pithy lines that jumped out at me, but this one, you describe the Spygate scandal, I believe, as the Clintons hired a bunch of con men who got their dirty cop friends to frame Trump. The press and a corrupt prosecutor handled the cover-up. Again, in just two sentences, all sorts of massive allegations, right, if true, and of course we've been speaking about some of them. How were the Clintons involved, in your view?
What's the Clinton campaign that paid for Fusion GPS?
Right.
Fusion GPS, those are the con men, and the dirty cops are the people who were running the Crossfire Hurricane investigation. The investigation that was not an investigation; it was an operation. The entire thing was nonsense from the outset. What I don't believe I include in there in much detail is the role of the press in this. Look, I mean, you and I are, as many other people in your audience, and some of the fantastic writers at Epoch Times, as we've spoken about before, like Jeff Carlson, who's done just amazing work, and I mention him in the book, how much his work informed my understanding of what happened. But we have to keep in mind, there's a lot of Americans around the country, even if they don't know the details of this, they understood the nature of what happened right away. It's a very simple story in that way. The details, the breadth, and the scope of the story is stunning, jaw-dropping, amazing. But the basic thing of what happened is it's very simple, right? And when I said before, if you think about it in terms of Watergate, it's easy to understand. It was an electronic break-in. The Clinton campaign wanted to find an October surprise to dump on Donald Trump. That's what they did, right? We can talk about the spy warrant. We can talk about when the Steele dossier got here or got there. But the fundamental picture is very clear. And part of what Congressman Nunes' job has been the last several years is to get the information, to get all of the information to the American public so that they understand the picture more clearly. It's not to confuse issues the way that the press has confused issues. It's not to confuse things the way that James Comey or John Brennan have. You know, John Brennan is a madman on Twitter. I mean, the idea that this man somehow directed the Central Intelligence Agency it's a horrifying thought. But Congressman Nunes' job has been to show a full picture of what happened. But that full picture, it's not to complicate matters. It's very clear what happened here. We're just shocked because we can't believe in the United States, first of all, that we can't believe that the people who are sworn to protect us and that these programs that are supposed to be used to defend us against terrorists and against adversarial foreign powers have instead been used against the presidential campaign. That's what's terrifying for us, the idea that if they can use these programs against the presidential campaign, they can use them against anyone. But the basic thing that there are dirty cops around the world, I mean, there are lots of movies about this, Serpico, all sorts of things. This is not surprising. Are there dirty cops at the FBI? Of course there are. Is the majority of that institution upstanding, fantastic citizens, and they serve and protect the American people? Absolutely. Same, I'm sure, with the CIA. The problem is there is a group of these people who did something that's going to make it very, very difficult for these institutions to come out the same way.
You know, one of the things, you mentioned the word terrifying. The thing, when I read your book, the thing that I find most terrifying, perhaps because I'm in the realm of journalism, is the role of the media. And frankly, maybe it's just because I couldn't imagine, but I wasn't maybe aware of the depth and breadth and that you know, in some meticulous detail actually describe in there. For example, you know, kind of the same people doing kind of following the story and adding kind of new bits as they come. Maybe can you speak to this whole realm of the press's involvement?
Right. Well, sure. That was another institution that's taken an enormous, or that's going to come out of this extremely damaged. I mean, I believe that one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that we've always known that the press leans left, and that's fine. The last time the New York Times, for instance, endorsed a Republican candidate for president was Eisenhower in 1956. So that's not an issue. What we've seen over the last several years is something entirely different with Russia, with the Russiagate operation. This was a political operation that the press participated in, right? I believe this started to happen in the later part of the Obama years when the Obama administration was marketing the Iran deal, and they were what we call the echo chamber. They were using think tank experts from the think tank community. They were using the press while they had political officials briefing on this. And this is one of the ways that a lot of friends and I were able to pick up right away that the Russia stuff, the Trump-Russia stuff, was an operation. There was nothing real about it. The methods were the same as those the Obama administration used to sell the Iran deal.
Tell me, what are those methods? I mean, this is...
I mean, you see it coming through the same channels, some of the same journalists, some of the same people. They're given talking points for the echo chamber. They were giving talking points by Obama administration officials. These were validated by experts in the think tank community. But it was all the same ecosystem. It was all coming from the same place. And if you look at what happened with Russiagate, we're talking about the same thing. It's a singular ecosystem, right? There are a few fundamental press organizations that you need to get involved. You don't have to worry about if you can get the Washington Post, you don't worry about Salon, right? Salon will come along. If you have the New York Times, you're not concerned about a number of major figures on social media because they'll go along as well. You need the core previously most prestigious news organizations in America. You need to bring them along. And even you can break it down even further. You can get a few people, a few significant people covering certain beats, and once you've brought them along, you have a large, if not all, of the press. And that's what happened over the last several years with the Trump-Russia reporting. You had different core units, different core teams who were being fed this stuff, especially at the Washington Post and the New York Times, who were being fed this stuff by, as it turns out, people who had usually largely served under Obama. They were taking this information. And again, these are not whistleblowers. These are not people. And how do we know? Because they're going to the same reporters again and again and again. They were prosecuting a campaign of political warfare against a sitting president, and it could not have happened without the press. So you're saying this is one of the things that's upsetting to you? I think it's a horrible thing. I think right now we do not have a free press. We have, thank goodness for organizations like Epoch Times. There are other places I'm proud to write for, the places I write for, including Tablet, Real Clear Investigations, The Federalist from time to time, and there are other terrific places. But when we were once talking about a lively and vibrant free press where there was plenty of room for disagreement, we do not have that anymore. The idea that, I mean, it's shameful. The idea that now there are people around the entire country, it's not just people at Trump rallies saying fake news and they're booing the reporters from CNN. There are people who used to take the New York Times and the Washington Post extremely seriously, who recognized that they were important institutions for mediating institutions where Americans are supposed to debate the important issues of the day,
Sure.
right? And that's where we would like to get back to, where, look, you hear many of the Republicans rightly saying this, like, why are the Democrats keep pushing this stuff? Let's get back and debate the things we need to argue, whether it's about health care, whether it's about the economy, whether it's about gun control, whether it's about foreign policy. These are the important things. One of the enormous casualties of the last 3 years is the press can no longer be a mediating institution for those debates. Those debates, I hope, will again take place, but not through what we've come to think of as our prestige press over the last several decades.
So, Lee, this is also, huge allegation, right? That the press is so deeply complicit, as you argue. And I'm wondering, could you offer some specifics as well? Because we've talked kind of in a general sense,
right.
But I think that's important
right.
for this interview.
Right. I mean, I've spoken before. I mentioned it in the book. If you look at the 2018 Pulitzer Prize, jointly awarded to the New York Times and the Washington Post, look at the stories that are cited in that award. Many of those stories are, if the reporting is to be believed, and the reporting claims this, that they're sourced to leaks of classified information. As I've said again, these are not whistleblowers. What went on, the conversation between General Flynn and the former Russian ambassador, who's blowing a whistle there? What happened? As Trump said to James Comey, Flynn did nothing wrong in that call. Of course he didn't. He was the incoming national security advisor. He's the president's point man, or the president-elect's point man on foreign policy. He's supposed to be having these phone calls with ambassadors and with foreign officials. So why was that leaked to the paper? It was leaked to the paper to further the anti-Trump operation, to further paint the Trump campaign, transition team, and then presidency as compromised, under control of the Russians. If you look at a number of the other leaks, again, why would you leak the entire transcript of Trump's conversation with the Prime Minister of Australia, the President of Mexico? What purpose do these things serve? To understand what, again, there's a reason that these calls are not supposed to be leaked to the press. The president is supposed to be able to make foreign policy. So that, I mean, the evidence is there in the press itself. That's why I would say I understand your language. They're not allegations I'm making. These are things the press has claimed. This is what they've done. This is a leak. If you look at what happened with the former Attorney General Jeff Sessions leak, this is a shocking one. If you're, again, to believe the Washington Post's reporting on how they got this information, the intelligence community was picking up an intercept of a conversation between the former Russian ambassador and his colleagues back in Moscow. That appears to be saying is the intelligence community was leaking the substance of information gathered of what they intercepted between foreign officials, all to prosecute a campaign against the Trump team. So again, these are not just allegations I'm making. Mm-hmm. This is what the press is saying about what it itself did.
The evidence is in plain sight, basically.
All you have to do is understand what they're saying and what they're doing. There's nothing mysterious about it. Right. It's right there. You just need to understand. Well, again, we see it's a campaign. If you were to see, we know the difference between a whistleblower and a political operative. As I've said before about Kasia Patel, when Kasia Patel was going after different abuses and crimes and part of Congressman Nunes' investigation, when they're going after him now, what you saw also, there's a part of the book, I believe it's the Valley of Death chapter, mm-hmm. where Congressman Nunes is talking about his sources who are bringing him information about how Obama officials unmasked Trump transition team officials. And his communications director, Jack Langer, says, these guys, what the press could have done is they could have gone out and found out about Nunes' story, which is shocking, right? If Obama officials are using the intelligence, the resources of the intelligence community to spy on political opponents, that's a terrible thing. That should have been the story the press was following. Instead, what did they do? They wanted to reveal who Nunes' sources were. They wanted to blow the whistle on whistleblowers. So that's what's been going on the entire time. It's a political operation. This is not about people it's not about intelligence community officials who are serving the public good, and it's not about the press who is putting information into the public sphere to help inform our public to make better decisions. In fact, what's happened is the press has served as a platform for a conspiracy theory for the last 3 years. And the reason the press is in trouble and the reason the country is in trouble is because you can't insert a conspiracy theory in the public sphere for 3 years and not expect that the damage will be serious. And it is serious. For 3 years, the press has been the platform for an enormous and disgusting lie. And the way that I see it, well, I've put it this way in other places, it's an extinction level event. We will continue to have places named the New York Times and the Washington Post, but the prestige that they had once earned is no longer theirs. I mean, it's as if we had people who were bragging, as I write in the book, bragging that they were on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion beat. It's an obscene conspiracy theory. It's obscene what intelligence officials, political operatives, and media industry professionals have done the last 3 years. And the purpose of my book was to try to explain to the public what had happened, what Congressman Nunes had been looking at for the last 3 years, and also to give some sort of indication of what U.S. Attorney John Durham is likely looking at right now. I don't know to what extent he's looking at the press. I actually don't know to what extent he's looking at anything. I have no particular insight on that. What I do know is what Congressman Nunes' investigation, what that looked like, and the leads that Mr. Durham is likely to pursue, given on that important, groundbreaking work.
To this point, around the media, I actually engaged Chris Blackburn this morning on Twitter, someone that is mentioned in your book.
A friend, a source, yeah.
What really caught my eye was the headline of this article. UK intelligence officials shaken by Trump administration's requests for help with counter-impeachment inquiry.
Right.
Right, as if this whole investigation of Durham's is a response to, impeachment.
Right. Well, one of the things that we've seen, and when we talk about the different abuses and crimes that have happened here, one of the things we've seen is the widespread abuse of the English language. Right. We saw it first when Stefan Halper was named last spring, when his name was leaked by the Washington Post and the New York Times. It's preposterous. Spygate. There was no one spying on the Trump campaign. Then within a few short months, like, well, okay, as James Clapper said, well, yes, of course, there was spying on the Trump campaign, but that was a good thing. It was for Trump's own good. What we've seen over the last couple months now is, oh, the deep state, that's a conspiracy theory. And now what we see, we have different people saying, for instance, John McLaughlin, former FBI deputy director, and New York Times columnist James Stewart, who's written a book about it. As it turns out, there is a deep state, and it's a very good thing. So here we have the abusive language referring to the counter-impeachment probe, right? This is preposterous. We were going to look at what happened. The reason that Jeff Sessions had been sidelined was to prevent anyone from looking at what happened. When the next Attorney General came in, he was clearly going to look at what happened. Why? Because Robert Mueller found no evidence of collusion. But surely something happened here. There was an investigation. There was a special counsel. If there was no collusion, what happened? Clearly, the Attorney General was going to need to get to the bottom of it, as was the president's desire to get to the bottom of it, which is what he expressed to the Ukrainian president when he said, our country has been through an awful lot. So it is the job of the president, and it's the job of the Attorney General to find out exactly what happened. So the idea that this is somehow a counter-impeachment probe is preposterous. My sense is the way this is actually working is the reason we're seeing so much intensity behind impeachment based on nothing, based on something more preposterous than the Steele dossier, only for one reason, and that is because there is evidence for anyone who cares to look at it of what actually transpired on the phone call. We have a transcript. What we're looking at in the whistleblower's complaint, we're looking at a fairy tale version of it. We're looking at the Washington Post op-ed version of what actually happened. The reason that is being pushed with such intensity is because it's a political instrument that serves two purposes. First, of course, is they've wanted to impeach Trump since he was elected, long before his inauguration. There's another purpose as well. It's a defensive instrument. It's a defensive instrument to push back against the investigation of the FBI's investigators. You can imagine what the political optics would look like entering an election cycle if Clinton operatives and former Obama officials, Democrats, are being indicted. I don't know if this will happen, but you can imagine that some overseer for the Democratic Party, someone with an eye to the future perhaps, might see that that's a problem. So this is what's happening. This is not a counter-impeachment probe. This is a genuine investigation to find out what went on here between late 2015, early 2016, and the present, because what we're seeing is a continuation of Russiagate. It's not a different thing. It's the same exact thing.
You know, in this discussion that we kind of had on Twitter this morning with a number of lively contributors, so to speak, someone pointed out that, and I actually pointed out what you point out, I think, in the book, which is that if, Mifsud, if he is if he is a Russian asset, as it's suggested in the Mueller report, that is, and I think actually Congressman Nunes spoke to us when we spoke earlier.
Right.
This is a massive, massive national security issue of epic proportions.
Epic proportions.
Right.
We'll be doing damage assessments for the next half century. Right.
And except that, so of course you would want to investigate them. Of course you would want to look at these different,
among other things.
You wouldn't, the UK intelligence community wouldn't be shocked to learn that.
Right.
It's fascinating.
Right, but of course what we know is, as Chris Blackburn has pointed out, what we know from looking at Professor Mifsud's different networks in London as well as Rome, and as well as the different places he traveled, we know who his associates were. We know the nature of the sorts of things he was actually doing. He was, I mean, remember, George Papadopoulos had accepted a guilty plea from Mueller's special counsel. And within a week or so after, there's a picture of Joseph Mifsud at a fundraiser in England standing next to the man who is now the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson. So the idea that if this were real, what we were saying about Mifsud, the idea that the FBI or the CIA, no one would give our British counterparts a heads up, hey, that guy, Mifsud, that Maltese professor who works at London Academy of Diplomacy and Link Campus in Rome, be careful because we believe he's a Russian asset. These things never happened.
Lee, something that I thought was very interesting, you describe this whole thing as a paper coup.
Yes.
Right, and you even I think you interviewed Edward Luttbuck, right?
Yes, I spoke with him.
Who wrote Coup d'etat, Practical
Yes, right.
Handbook, and so forth. And he describes it as a very American coup.
Yes.
Which I thought was, again,
very good line.
Very, very, very interesting.
Yeah.
To finish up, tell me, a paper coup, American coup, coup at all.
It continues to be a real coup. It's a real thing. Just because the White House has not been surrounded by tanks and cannons, or it's not like the attempted coup in Turkey in July 2016, where there are planes and tanks. It was this coup, this very American coup. They used memos. They used documents, some of them falsified, like the Steele dossier, like the intelligence community assessment. But the entire purpose was to topple a sitting president. It was a coup. It's not a...
Not hyperbole, in your view.
No,
yeah.
It's not a figure of speech. It's not a way to talk about people who don't like Donald Trump and what they want to do. They tried to topple a sitting president through all sorts of different means. And it was James Comey who initiated this in March 2017 when he testified before Congressman Nunes' committee, and he revealed there was an investigation on Donald Trump. At that point, anything that Trump did out of self-preservation even, would land him in the middle of an obstruction trap. And of course, that's precisely what happened after Trump fired James Comey. There was, within what people have taken to call the 9 days of May, is when the special counsel, Comey's predecessor as FBI director, Robert Mueller, was named as special counsel. So that was the whole point. No matter what Trump did, they were going to surround him with personnel that were against him. And the point of what the personnel were going to do was going to be produced paper to hem Trump in and to force him out. So that's what I meant by the paper coup. Just because there were not tanks, just because there was not artillery, just because the coup was not waged by the Pentagon, by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but it was waged by the higher levels of the FBI and Department of Justice. It's a real thing. And it's ongoing today. This is what the impeachment proceeding is about. And this is a continuation of that.
You know, a lot of our viewers, people who, believe some version of what we've been discussing today, understand it as some version of reality, as some kind of truth. They may feel very maybe helpless or hopeless. I see a lot of people, following on Twitter, no one's ever going to get charged. It's impossible. The deep state is too powerful. I've seen a lot of that.
Right.
Will there ever be? Is this Horowitz report going to be deep sixed? This is even a question I think that Senator Grassley raised.
Right.
What do you think about that?
As long as I've been speaking with Congressman Nunes about this, he's talked about two different things. He said, first, we need an accounting. And this book, The Plot Against the President, is largely the accounting of what the congressman and what his committee did, what that team did, which I write in the book. They had a name for their investigation, Objective Medusa.
Right.
So this is an accounting of what they did. There's much more to the story, much more to the story at large, but this is what they did. The other thing that Congressman Nunes has spoken about is accountability. And this is what the people who did bad things, they have to pay for what they did. I'm extremely optimistic that the Attorney General, William Barr, and the U.S. Attorney, John Durham, are serious people. And again, the intensity of the impeachment proceedings, as well as the different comments from people like James Comey and John Brennan, tells me that this is a serious investigation and that people are concerned. I think it's absolutely essential that the people who did these things have to pay. If not, it will reinforce the belief that many Americans already have right now that we have a two-tier system of justice, and that some people can get away with whatever they want, no matter how much it's to advance their own personal and narrow interest against that of the United States, and the American voter, and the American taxpayer. If there is no accountability, we're in more trouble. We're in more trouble than it appears we are now. But I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that both Mr. Barr and Mr. Durham understands how important it is that we have accountability.
Lee Smith, such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thanks so much.